feel like I've run a marathon. How do y'all feel? Wonderful. Fabulous. Blessed. Woo! You all know how I love an interactive audience. You know, I'm just blessed to be back in Shreveport. I've missed you all. And I am honored to be bringing you the Mother's Day message. Now, you all know me pretty well, or most of you do, and you know that I am always an intellectually curious person. So when something comes up or something comes around, you ask me a question, I don't know it, I'm going to go find the answer. And I am just thrilled that we have things like Google now. You know, used to you had to go to the library, you had to pull out those little boxes, you had to go through those cards, then you had to go to the research section. Shoot, now I just pull up my phone, type it in. I don't even have to type it anymore, I can just say it. And so what I did this week was I went onto Wikipedia to find out, why do we celebrate Mother's Day? Where did that come from? You know, for all we know, we're doing something pagan or something. And so I wanted to know. So what I found was a woman named Anna Jarvis first suggested the national observance of an annual day honoring all mothers. And she did that because she loved her own mother so much. And so at a memorial service for a mother on May 10th in 1908, she gave a flower, a carnation actually, because it was her mother's favorite flower, to every person who attended that memorial. And the idea later came about of a day to honor mothers, and it gained more and more popularity until on May 9th, 1914. Anybody alive in 1914? I didn't really think so. By an act of Congress, President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed the second Sunday in May as Mother's Day. He established the day as a time for public expressions of our love and reverence for the mothers of our country. Now, we all know that mothers don't have it easy today, and I once heard about how the mother of 3 very notorious kids was asked, if you had it to do all over again, would you have children? And she said, yes, but not the same ones. Now, you all know I love to study the women of the Bible, so this Mother's Day I've chosen a special mother from the Old Testament, and she is found in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. Now, I have asked my spiritual granddaughter, Desiree, to come and tell you the story of Bathsheba.
Okay, so it was in the springtime. It's considered a time of war for the kings. And David sent Joab and his men out to fight the Ammonites. But David stayed in Jerusalem. So one night he was up on his roof just kind of wandering around. And he saw a woman bathing on her roof, and he thought that she was really pretty. So he sent his servants out to find out who she was, and they came back and told him that she was the daughter of Eliam, Bathsheba, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So he said, okay, well, bring her over to me. So she went over, and then he slept with her. And so after a time, then she sent a message to him saying that she was pregnant. And so he used that, and then he sent Joab to go find Uriah. So he brought Uriah to the palace, and he said, you've been working really hard. I think that you should go home and take some rest. And so Uriah said, okay, and he sent him off with some gifts. But when he woke up the next morning, he found Uriah in front of the palace sleeping with the men, and he said, Uriah, why didn't you go home? And Uriah said, well, I didn't think it was right while my men slept on the ground that I go home with my wife. I'd rather be here with the men. And so David's plan didn't really work out, so he sent David to have a big feast with him, and Uriah got drunk, and he wanted Uriah to go home, but Uriah still didn't go home. So he sent Joab, and he told him, put Uriah in the front of the battle with the defenders, and then draw back so that he'll be attacked. So this happened, and Uriah died, and Joab sent the message back with a messenger, and the messenger told him. So after Bathsheba had mourned for the loss of her husband, she was sent to the palace with David, and she stayed there. Then the prophet Nathan came to the castle to David, and he told him a story of a rich man and a poor man in a field. And the rich man had a bunch of sheep and cattle and chickens, and the poor man all he had was his lamb and a chicken. And he'd raised this lamb, and this lamb slept with him. He thought of it as a daughter, and drank out of the same bowl, ate off the same plate. And Nathan said, a traveler came by and to the rich man, and the rich man, instead of killing his own lamb, he went and killed the poor man's lamb. And David said, well, this is awful. That man needs to pay back. He needs to give him 4 times what he took. And Nathan said, don't you realize that man, the rich man is you. You took what was not yours. And so David realized the error of his ways, and he realized that he sinned. And so Nathan told him that Bathsheba's child would not be able to live, that the child would die. And so the 7 days that the child lived, David went and mourned, and he slept on the ground and he wouldn't eat. And then after the child died, he went and he cleansed himself and he worshiped the Lord. And the servant said, why are you praising and you mourned while the child was alive? And he said, because there's nothing I can do. He said that God decided not to let this child live, so there's nothing I can do. So he went and comforted Bathsheba, and then he slept with her again, and they had another child, which is named Solomon. And Nathan came back and he said, this child should be named Jebediah, beloved of God.
Very good. Now, how many of you could have paraphrased 2 chapters in the Bible as well as that young lady did? She takes after her spiritual grandmother. Now, Bathsheba's someone different, and she's usually not remembered for her motherhood. And in all the research I did for this sermon, I did not find anyone else who had ever chosen to use Bathsheba as an example for Mother's Day. But I think for whatever reason, we're able to grant David forgiveness and restoration, but Bathsheba remains always in our minds and blazoned on our consciousness as an adulterer. And today I hope to give you the rest of her story. I want to move past all the sordid details of adultery and concentrate on the factors of her life that speak well of her and show how she is a godly woman. But she just happens to have a skeleton in her closet. Now, how many of you, put your hand up real high, how many of you have a skeleton in your closet? You don't have to do that. But I will admit, I do. I think we all have something in our past that we didn't handle very well. And for some strange reason, we don't focus on the fact that Bathsheba is a godly woman when we think about her, and we only remember that skeleton that is in her past. And why do you think that is? Do we truly believe in grace? You can raise your hand now. Can we have a sordid past and become a hero of the faith? Obviously we can. If God forgets our sins, then why can't we? Why can't we let things go? Why do we hang on to them? Well, let's begin by talking about her godly heritage, and then we will briefly touch on the skeleton in her closet, and then focus on her godly life after that incident, and then we will close with an insight into the Proverbs 31 woman, something that will make you think as you leave this service today, which you all know is my goal. Now, Bathsheba was born to a man named Eliam, and that's in 2 Samuel 11:3, and who was also called Ameliel in 1 Chronicles 3:5. But both names mean essentially the same. It means God is my kinsman. Now, we could paraphrase that and say his name means I am part of the family of God. Biblical names often were prophetic. They were descriptive of a person's life. Remember that Jacob's name meant a cheater. David was beloved. Moses meant to draw out. Isn't that a fitting name for the person who led the Exodus? And it seemed that Elam was an Old Testament example of a child of God. In 2 Samuel 23, there is a listing of David's mighty men of valor, men who excelled in virtue and fighting skills, and they became his most trusted allies and confidants. Eliam is a member of that group. 2 Samuel 23:34 states, and Eliam, who the son of Ahithophel, the Gileonite. So thus far we know that Bathsheba's father had a name that means God is my kinsman, and he was one of David's most valiant and trusted soldiers. Thus we know she was raised in a good family. Now I know that does not make her a perfect woman, but right now we're just giving some background that includes the fact that she came from a godly family. 2 more important facts from her father's life, and the first is the man he chose for his daughter to marry. We know that he is called Uriah, or rather Uriah, the Hittite. What you may not know about Uriah is that in 2 Samuel 23:39, Uriah the Hittite is also listed as one of David's mighty men of valor. In all likelihood, Uriah was a proselyte to the Jewish faith, perhaps inspired by the life of David to do so. Eliam was, as a devout Jew, would have been very, very careful whom he chose for his daughter to marry. Remember, in antiquity, marriages were arranged by parents, not by ChristianMingle.com. That he chose a Hittite speaks volumes to the character and nobility he saw in Uriah. The wisdom of that choice proves itself out as Uriah shows himself to be of more noble character than that of David himself, just in the brief glimpses that we have of his life. Uriah is a Hebrew name that is translated light or flame of Yahweh, or Yahweh is my light. And one of the horrible ironies of this whole David and Uriah story is that David may have murdered a man he won to the Lord. Yet David is still known as the man after God's own heart. Today, what I want to suggest is that you don't have to have lived a perfect life to be very special in God's eyes. It is not how you start out that matters, but how you end up. I believe very strongly that Bathsheba was a very special woman in God's eyes, not because she was perfect, but like David, she was a woman after God's own heart. Her family history tells us a little about the way she was probably raised. And the second fact I want to point out about her father is the name Eliam chose for his daughter, Bathsheba. Bathsheba means daughter of the oath. This could be a reference to the promise of Abraham or some thanksgiving promise made to God by her father and mother. Either way, it again shines a light on the genuine faith her father had. She was raised in a home that honored God. They displayed bravery against the Lord's enemies and was a close confidant of one of the Old Testament's greatest heroes. As my mother used to tell me, birds of a feather do flock together. How many of your mother ever told you that? Now let's take a look at the grandfather, Ahithophel. Remember, Ahithophel is named as Eliam's father in the second part of 2 Samuel 23:34. Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Gileonite. Now you will note that Ahithophel is from Gilead, and here in 2 Samuel it is confirmed that this was the Ahithophel that was David's counselor in 2 Samuel 15:12, which states, and Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gileonite, David's counselor from this city, even from Gilead, while he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. Ahithophel was said to be a very incredible counselor whose words almost seemed to come from God himself. 2 Samuel 16:23 says, "This counsel that Ahithophel gave in those days was treated as if God himself had spoken." That was the reputation of Ahithophel's counsel to David. Now, it's true that Ahithophel later turned against David, but for now I just want you to consider that his words and the testimony of his life showed him to be a great man of wisdom that probably came from a close walk with God. And David describes him as a devout man of faith in Psalms 55:12, 13, and 14. For it says, "For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it. Nor is it the one who hates me, who has exalted himself against me, then I could hide myself from it. But it is a man my equal, my companion and my familiar friend, who had sweet fellowship together, walked in the house of the God in the throng." In that passage, which is also applied to Judas and Jesus, David is describing the shock that one who had worshiped God with him regularly was also the one who had betrayed him. Lay aside that betrayal for a moment. I will get back to it. But for now, I just want you to realize what kind of life you must live for people to say that when you speak, it's almost as if God himself is speaking. That's an accolade of the highest order, and it can only come from a close walk with God. We have learned that Bathsheba was born to a godly man and had a godly grandfather. This does not sound like the home of the evil woman who tempted David into adultery and murder, does it? David sought Bathsheba out, not the other way around. She was married to a mighty man of valor and known in the kingdom, and that was all tarnished, as was Ahithophel's family name with what David had done. The Bible says a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. I used to tell my girls when they walked out of the house in the morning, remember who you belong to. You are God's child, but you are also mine. Behave accordingly. A good name is rather to be chosen rather than riches. It is understandable that Ahithophel turned against David. I'm not condoning what Ahithophel did, simply explaining a possible motive for why such a godly man would turn against David, his friend and confidant, his brother in the Lord. If David was the mostly guilty party and he did that to your granddaughter and your family reputation, and all of a sudden there was another candidate for king, or in our case, president, ask yourself, what would you do? I want you to notice the fact that in chapter 12, that when the prophet Nathan goes to confront him, it is David that is charged with sin, and not one word was spoken about Bathsheba. David is punished, not Bathsheba. All the consequences of the adultery are directed at David, and though Bathsheba will also suffer because of some of them, they are not said to be aimed at her. Consider also that when David saw Bathsheba, he asked about who she was and was told that she was A, married, and B, married to one of David's most loyal soldiers. So when he called for her after getting that information, he was willfully sinning on his own. He sent for her, thus the bulk of the blame needs to be laid at his feet, not hers. And that seems to be the way God, through the prophet Nathan, laid out the events. Then in 2 Samuel 11:27, we read that when the morning was past for Uriah, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Now let's consider Bathsheba's actions after she became David's wife. 2 Samuel 12:24 and 25. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba and went into her and lay with her, and she gave birth to a son, and he named him Solomon. Now the Lord loved him and sent word through Nathan the prophet, and he named him Jedediah for the Lord's sake. Jedediah is the name the prophet gave him, and it means beloved of Jehovah. He was also given the name Solomon, which is the name he is most known for. Solomon means peace. Now the Lord loved him. That's what the word says. Does that sound to you like God still holding something against David or Bathsheba? I don't think so. I think it's quite the opposite. God uses this to show us there is life after adultery and any sin that we have in our lives. But not just life, abundant life. All we have to do is surrender our lives to God. God chastised them for their sin as a lesson to us as well, and he gave them a wonderful heritage after repentance, also as a lesson to all of us. Bathsheba is not the story of a woman defined by her past, but the story of how great God's grace can be in a person's life, regardless of what is in the past. She is not the model of a perfect woman, but of a woman whose life was amazingly touched by grace, and how completely accepted she was after that touch. And that is what makes her a model mother. God took away her tarnished name and the shame, and he told her and David quite clearly, I love your child and am blessing you. Bathsheba had 3 other children with David, and I want to show you something interesting about one of them in particular. In 1 Chronicles 3:5, it states, "And these were born to him in Jerusalem, Shimei, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon, 4 by Bathsheba, the daughter of Amiel." Did you notice the name Nathan as one of her sons? Do you remember that Nathan is the prophet who confronted David? And yet David and Bathsheba wind up naming one of their sons after him. The man who confronted David in sin becomes so highly regarded by them that they name one of their children after him. That is clearly a byproduct of salvation. And that is appreciation for those who rebuke you when you are going down the wrong path. Now stay with me, it gets better. We all know that Solomon is in Jesus' lineage. In Matthew 1:6 it says, "And to Jesse was born David, the king, and to David was born Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah." But did you also know that another of Bathsheba's sons are in the lineage of Jesus? In Luke 3:31 it says, "Which was the son of Meliah, which was the son of Menan, which was the son of Mattathias, which was the son of Nathan, which was the son of David." Now, Matthew is believed to be Joseph's genealogy, and Mary's is found in Luke. Not just one of her children, but two of them are in Jesus' lineage. So let's recap. So far, Bathsheba comes from a godly family. Two of her children are in Jesus' lineage. Her second son is proclaimed to be beloved of Jehovah, and she names one of her children after the prophet Nathan. Even if she is equally at fault with David in the adultery, she appears from the scriptural record to be a wonderful example of the acceptance and elevation of sinner from the kingdom of darkness into God's marvelous light. David had 8 wives and perhaps as many as 10 concubines. God could have chosen from any one of these women for the lineage of Christ, but he chose Bathsheba for that honor. He crowned her life with blessings, and that is exactly what grace does for each and every one of us. When God saves someone, he doesn't just forgive them. He elevates them. A robe, a ring, a fatted calf, a seat at the Father's banqueting table. And Bathsheba is the story of a woman with a skeleton in her closet who became a chosen member of the royal family. She is not barely saved, but fully and wonderfully saved. And so it is with all God's sons and daughters. God doesn't put a Band-Aid on your heart. He puts a crown on your head. You don't wear rags after you get saved. You wear the robes of salvation. Lastly, since it is Mother's Day, I want to direct you to the Proverbs 31 woman. I want to briefly touch on Bathsheba as an example of a godly mother in Proverbs 31. Now, we've all heard it. We all know about Proverbs 31. It's a laying out in order of what an exemplary model of a woman is supposed to be. Now, let me tell you what you don't know about Proverbs 31. It begins with the words of King Lemuel, the oracle which his mother taught him. Let's stop right there. Who is Lemuel and who is his mother? Now, prior to the 19th century, Jewish and Christian authorities were almost unanimous in ascribing who the king and his mother were. But to be accurate today, recent scholarships will kind of argue that. But today, I am going with the old school. I am old, which says that Lemuel was a pet name for Solomon given to him by his mother, Bathsheba. In fact, the Jewish authorities say that this was a passage given to Solomon by his mother Bathsheba as a reproof on his marriage with Pharaoh's daughter. And it makes sense because the chapter discusses Solomon's 2 greatest weaknesses, wine and women. And verses 4 and 5 deal with the wine issue. Proverbs 31, 4 and 5. Leaders can't afford to make fools of themselves, gulping wine and swilling beer, lest hungover They don't know right from wrong, and the people who depend on them are hurt. Ooh, I can see a mother saying that. And verses 10 through the end of the chapter describe what a godly woman is like, that the king should be wanting to marry. So here in Proverbs 31, we have a mother, not being defined by her past, but being a mother and attempting to teach her son to live a godly life, to find and marry a virtuous woman and not one that simply appeals to the eyes. This is mothering at the finest. All of you women who have heard sermons about being a Proverbs 31 woman, isn't it amazing that it was probably written by Bathsheba, a woman of grace? And what a show of grace. Bathsheba is not a perfect woman with a perfect past. She is a redeemed woman, an example to all the mothers, past, present, and future, who have not lived a perfect life. She has been an example to me. I am not a perfect woman. I have not lived a perfect life. But I know that through God's grace, I wear a crown. We know God can take us from the worst of times and put us in His lineage to be His child. Are there any Bathshebas here today? Anyone who has a skeleton in their closet, something in your past you can't forget? Let God's grace move you forward and away from that sin. God does not look to your past to determine your future. And as I close, I want you to know that these altars are always open. An opportunity to present yourself before the Lord, to get rid of any garbage you're carrying from your past. An opportunity to lay it at the Lord's feet and walk away from it. You don't have to carry it with you. The skeleton doesn't have to stay in the closet. You can throw it out and wear God's crown of grace, His robes of redemption. God loves you, and so do I, and so do others who are gathered here today. Come and allow us to show you that love. Thank you.